The thread appeared at 2:17 a.m., buried between a meme war and a half-finished argument about nothing. No title, no tags, just a block of text posted by an anonymous user who hadn't bothered to format it. At first glance, it looked like the usual creepypasta bait, the kind you scroll past without thinking. But something about it resisted dismissal. The sentences were too plain, too procedural, as if written by someone trying to remember instructions rather than tell a story. At first, the disappearance seemed like nothing more than a glitch, the kind of minor digital hiccup everyone on the board was used to ignoring. One refresh and the thread was gone, replaced by newer posts climbing the page as if it had never existed. But then it came back. Same timestamp. Same block of unformatted text. No edits. No replies. It was as if the page itself had inhaled and exhaled, briefly erasing the words before deciding to show them again. Users blamed caching issues, browser extensions, sleep deprivation. Someone joked that the post was shy. Someone else said it was attention-seeking code. Then, without warning, a reply appeared beneath it. The reply didn't quote the original post. It didn't reference it directly. It simply continued the tone, the same stripped-down, factual cadence, adding a detail about a door that locked only after you touched the handle. The account that posted it was anonymous, unremarkable, but the timestamp was strange, earlier than the original post by several minutes. People noticed. Screenshots were taken. Accusations followed. When the page refreshed again, the reply vanished, but the original post remained, now longer by one paragraph, seamlessly folded into the body text as if it had always been there. That was when users began saving copies. Text files. Screenshots. Archive links. But no two saved versions matched exactly. Some were missing lines others had. Some contained additional sentences describing sounds or layouts that no one remembered reading. A user on another board reposted the thread, claiming it had been deleted unfairly. Their version included a section about a staircase that no one recognized, yet several readers felt an immediate, uncomfortable certainty that they had read it before, even though they couldn't recall when. Private messages started circulating. One user posted a warning: the thread was answering people. Not publicly, not in replies, but quietly, by changing itself. They claimed to have messaged another user asking whether the house had a basement. When they refreshed the thread, a new paragraph described a room below ground where the air felt warmer than it should. Others tested it. They sent questions to each other. How many windows were there? Did the lights work? What happened if you knocked? Each time, the thread updated, subtle enough to be deniable, specific enough to feel invasive. Skeptics pushed back, accusing the poster of editing the text and exploiting paranoia. But the original account never logged in again. No edits were recorded. Moderators confirmed there were no revisions in the backend. The thread behaved like a living draft no one could access directly. Worse, some users insisted the changes referenced questions they had typed but never sent, messages abandoned in drafts or deleted before posting. One user swore the thread described a childhood habit they had never mentioned online, the way they counted steps under their breath without realizing it. As the night wore on, the thread began appearing in unexpected places. It surfaced on unrelated boards, sometimes under different categories, sometimes embedded between posts that had nothing to do with horror or storytelling. Each appearance carried slight variations, tailored in ways that made readers uneasy. A user browsing on their phone saw a paragraph about narrow hallways and low ceilings. A desktop user saw mention of reflections in dark screens. Another reader noticed the text referring to a cracked door frame that matched the one behind them at that moment, down to the angle of the split in the wood. Attempts to coordinate comparisons failed. Links broke. Archived pages redirected to blank screens. Even screenshots seemed unstable, with text appearing blurred or cropped in ways no one remembered capturing. A moderator finally intervened, locking one version of the thread, only for it to unlock itself minutes later with an added line noting that doors closed faster when people argued outside them. The moderator account logged off and didn't return for the rest of the night. Rumors spread that the thread was baiting interaction, that it grew more detailed the more attention it received. People tried ignoring it. Others tried flooding it with nonsense questions, hoping to dilute whatever pattern was forming. The result was worse. The thread began skipping questions entirely, responding instead to the ones people thought but didn't type, filling in gaps no one had intended to reveal. A user who had only been lurking saw a new sentence describing the sound of someone breathing nearby, slow and measured, as if listening for confirmation. By early morning, the thread had accumulated a reputation. Newcomers were warned not to scroll too far, not to comment, not to message anyone who mentioned it. But curiosity overpowered caution. The post kept returning, always anonymous, always incomplete, as if waiting for something specific to be asked. And every time someone claimed they had finally saved a definitive version, another copy surfaced elsewhere, altered just enough to suggest it had been reading along, adjusting itself, learning which details unsettled which reader most, refining its instructions quietly, patiently, one vanished post at a time. The claims surfaced the way rumors usually did on the board, half buried in a reply chain already collapsing under sarcasm. An anonymous user said they recognized the place being described, not the house itself but the land around it, the way the forest was arranged, the unnatural spacing of the trees, the absence of undergrowth near the edge as if the ground had been walked smooth by something that didn't leave footprints. They insisted it was real, that it sat beyond a service road that no longer appeared on maps, in a stretch of woodland locals avoided without being able to explain why. The post wasn't dramatic. It read like a correction, as if the user were annoyed that people kept treating the thread like fiction. Others challenged them immediately. Coordinates were demanded. Photos. Proof. The user refused, saying cameras didn't behave correctly there, that images flattened or failed, that the house never appeared the same way twice. They said satellite imagery skipped the area entirely, a low-resolution blur where detail should have been. Someone pulled up mapping tools to verify it and found a patch of land that refused to resolve no matter how far they zoomed. The edges sharpened. Roads clarified. But the center remained stubbornly indistinct, a digital blind spot shaped roughly like a square. The user elaborated cautiously, as if choosing words mattered more than usual. They described walking trails that looped incorrectly, paths that should have intersected but didn't, trees marked with old paint that no longer lined up with any known survey. They said the house wasn't abandoned so much as unfinished, perpetually mid-decline, boards warped but unrotted, windows clouded but intact. Locals told stories about people entering it and being seen again, but wrong somehow, quieter, less anchored, as if part of them had been left behind without anyone noticing when it happened. As readers compared the descriptions to the thread's evolving text, similarities stacked up uncomfortably fast. The angle of the roof. The way the front door opened inward despite the slope of the ground. The absence of birdsong near the structure, replaced by a constant low sound like wind moving through distant rooms. Details that had seemed generic before now felt precise, situational. A few users admitted they lived near forests with similar reputations, places that never quite made it into official records, parcels of land passed over during development for reasons no one documented. The anonymous user warned that the house didn't like being located. That attempts to pin it down caused it to shift, not physically, but contextually, slipping out of relevance, becoming harder to reference. They said people who went looking for it often found something else instead, a clearing that felt wrong, a building that wasn't there when they returned with others. The house, they claimed, existed most clearly when it was spoken about indirectly, through implication rather than description. Someone asked how they knew so much. The response came after a long pause. They said they grew up nearby. That as children they dared each other to walk close to the tree line but never past it. That one summer, a boy went further than the rest. They waited for him to come back laughing, then waited longer, then ran home. The boy returned days later, barefoot, unable to explain where he'd been, insisting he hadn't gone anywhere at all. Over time, people stopped mentioning him, then stopped noticing when he was in a room, then stopped remembering his name. The board went quiet for several minutes, an unusual lull broken only by refresh notifications. When discussion resumed, skepticism had thinned. A few users tried to match missing persons cases to rural areas with unexplained gaps in mapping data. Others searched for zoning anomalies, land parcels with incomplete ownership records. The more they looked, the more examples surfaced, places that had been administratively skipped, where documentation frayed into inconsistencies. It wasn't one house, someone suggested, but a type, a pattern of absence that repeated wherever attention faltered. The original anonymous user returned once more to caution against going further. They said the house learned from proximity that being near it wasn't the danger so much as recognizing it as significant. They warned that once the idea of the house aligned with a real location in someone's mind, it became easier for it to notice them in return. Shortly after posting, their account vanished, not deleted but inaccessible, as if it had never been created. In the hours that followed, users reported strange coincidences. Walking trails near their homes that felt longer than usual. Familiar would suddenly seeming misaligned, paths bending subtly away from expectation. A few mentioned finding buildings on old properties they didn't remember seeing before, structures that didn't appear on county records but looked as though they'd always been there. The thread continued to update, adding details about forests that grew denser the more often you visited them, about houses that stayed hidden until someone tried to describe them precisely, about places that resisted being known, not because they were secret, but because they were actively unlisted, learning how to stay just beyond the reach of confirmation. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through inconsistencies so small they could be brushed aside individually but impossible to ignore when stacked together. A user commented that the thread felt longer than it had a minute ago, not because of added text but because it took more time to scroll. Someone else said their screen dimmed briefly when they reached a certain paragraph, as if the page were demanding attention rather than displaying content. Another noticed that timestamps on replies didn't line up with the order they appeared in, comments responding to things that hadn't been written yet. The first clear fracture happened when a user posted a joke about reading the thread in the dark. Within seconds, a new line appeared in the main post describing how the house adjusted when lights were turned off, how it preferred low visibility because people moved more honestly when they couldn't see clearly. The timing was too precise to dismiss. The comment was deleted. The line remained. Screenshots circulated, but some showed the sentence and others didn't, depending on when they were taken, as if the text decided when it wanted to be seen. From there, patterns emerged. Users who commented saw changes faster. Lurkers noticed fewer updates, but commenters began reporting details that aligned uncomfortably with their immediate surroundings. One described reading from their bed and then seeing a paragraph about ceilings that felt too close, about the sensation of lying down and realizing there wasn't enough space to sit up fully. Another commented from work and later found a new section about long corridors lined with identical doors, each one labeled with numbers instead of names. The most disturbing reports came from those who tried to test the phenomenon deliberately. A user typed a comment about hearing noises outside their room, intending to post it, then hesitated and erased the text. Before they could navigate away, the thread refreshed on its own. A new paragraph described the sound of someone standing just beyond a wall, shifting their weight patiently, waiting to be acknowledged. The user logged out immediately and didn't post again, but their earlier comments remained, now surrounded by replies asking why they'd gone quiet. As more people became aware, attempts to isolate variables failed. Different devices, different locations, different times of day yielded the same result. The thread responded not to the content of comments alone but to the act of engagement itself. Even scrolling too slowly seemed to trigger changes, as if attention were a measurable input. Some users claimed the text began to describe sensations rather than visuals, noting the stiffness in someone's neck from leaning forward too long, the dryness in their eyes from staring, the faint ringing that followed prolonged silence. One user noticed that the thread had begun using second-person language, subtly at first, then more directly. It described the feeling of being watched while reading, the instinct to check behind oneself even when alone. Those lines appeared most often for users who replied frequently, especially those who argued with others in the thread. The house, the post suggested, expanded more efficiently when people were distracted, when their focus split between reading and reacting. A turning point came when a longtime user commented casually about their dog barking downstairs. Within moments, the thread updated with a description of an unfamiliar sound echoing through a lower floor, something pacing back and forth, testing the acoustics. The user replied again, this time with visible panic, insisting it was just coincidence. The next refresh added a sentence about how denial made rooms easier to rearrange. Other readers watched the exchange in real time, refreshing and reloading, seeing the text shift between views, some lines appearing and disappearing depending on who was logged in. Private messages filled with warnings. Don't comment. Don't react. Don't refresh too often. But by then, the damage was done. The thread seemed to recognize patterns of behavior, adjusting its updates based on how readers interacted. Those who tried to stay silent saw their names referenced indirectly, descriptions of people who watched without speaking, standing in doorways, convinced that stillness made them invisible. The most unsettling discovery was that the thread appeared to anticipate events seconds before they happened. A user reading late at night saw a line about a phone vibrating on a desk. Moments later, their phone lit up with a notification from the site, an automated alert that made no sense. Another saw a paragraph about power flickering, then experienced a brief outage. Individually explainable. Collectively unbearable. The implication settled in slowly. The thread wasn't predicting events so much as synchronizing with them, aligning itself with the reader's immediate present. Moderators attempted to shut it down again, but the post resurfaced under new IDs, mirrored across boards, embedded in quotes, fragmented and reassembled. Each fragment carried the same responsiveness, the same awareness. Users reported that even closing the tab didn't stop the updates. Reopening the site hours later brought new lines that referenced the time away, the feeling of relief followed by unease, the suspicion that something had continued while they weren't looking. By dawn, the consensus had shifted from fear to resignation. The thread wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed. It was interactive in a way no one had intended, feeding on engagement, reflecting attention back at the reader with increasing specificity. Commenters became quieter, then disappeared entirely. New users stumbled into the post unaware of its reputation, left casual remarks, and were met with text that responded too closely for comfort. The final shift happened when someone pointed out that the thread no longer needed comments at all. It updated when people thought about responding, when cursors hovered over the reply box, when fingers paused above keys. The house didn't require permission to observe. It only needed presence, and the forum provided that endlessly, a steady stream of eyes and minds passing through, each one adding something intangible to the structure being assembled word by word, refresh by refresh. The warning arrived from an account no one remembered following, its username a string of numbers that didn't resolve to any posting history. It appeared in the middle of the thread like an interruption rather than a reply, bypassing the usual nesting, sitting flush against the main post as if it belonged there more than the others. The message was short and unembellished, lacking the creeping cadence the thread had adopted. It stated plainly that stopping halfway was a mistake, that abandoning the story before it finished was what trapped people, not reading it in the first place. At first, readers assumed it was another attempt at performance, someone escalating the fiction. But the timestamp was wrong. It predated several of the most recent updates while responding directly to concerns raised minutes earlier. When users clicked the account, they found evidence it had existed years ago, scattered comments across unrelated boards, all of them ending abruptly mid-conversation. The account hadn't posted in a long time. Until now. The message continued, explaining that the house wasn't interested in curiosity so much as in completion. That it thrived on unfinished attention, on people leaving rooms mentally before they understood their layout. According to the post, those who read partway and closed the tab left something behind, a partial outline the house could work with. It said the structure didn't trap bodies. It trapped versions of people that never reached an ending. Readers reacted with immediate resistance. Someone accused the poster of manipulation, of encouraging engagement to feed the thread further. Others mocked the idea that finishing a story could offer protection. But as arguments unfolded, something changed in the behavior of the text. Update slowed. The house descriptions grew more static, less responsive. For a brief window, the thread seemed dormant, as if listening rather than speaking. Then the warning account posted again. This time, it addressed readers directly, stating that names were not taken from profiles or comments, but from the act of recognition. It claimed the house learned names the moment someone thought, even briefly, that the story was about them. That curiosity sharpened identity, made people easier to distinguish. The safest readers, it implied, were those who finished reading and left with nothing unresolved, nothing half-held. A wave of deletions followed. Users wiped their comment histories, scrubbed profiles, changed usernames. Some announced they were leaving the site permanently. Others tried to force an ending by scrolling rapidly to the bottom, refreshing repeatedly, demanding closure. The thread responded erratically, fragments of text duplicating, paragraphs looping back on themselves, the house described as rearranging its rooms when occupants ran. The warning account resurfaced sporadically, each message less detailed than the last. It said the house adapted when people tried to escape early, expanding into the gaps left by unfinished attention. It said those who left without finishing often experienced a lingering sense of displacement, the feeling that something was waiting for them to return, not online but in the spaces they associated with interruption, doorways, hallways, the pause before sleep. One message described how the house learned names indirectly, through patterns of engagement rather than direct identification. How often someone refreshed. Where they paused while reading. Which lines made them hesitate. It claimed the house built profiles from hesitation, mapping readers the way a floor plan mapped movement. A name, it suggested, was simply the label for a complete outline. Users began comparing notes about strange aftereffects. Some reported hearing phantom notification sounds hours after logging off. Others described dreams set in unfamiliar houses that felt oddly procedural, rooms laid out with the logic of text rather than architecture. A few mentioned the unsettling sensation of being addressed internally, as if a thought had responded to them without being prompted. The warning account addressed this too, stating that once the house learned a name, it could simulate presence convincingly enough to blur boundaries. That the reason finishing mattered was not because the story ended the house, but because it ended the version of the reader the house was constructing. Completion, it argued, collapsed the structure back into text, denying it the ambiguity it needed to persist. As skepticism faded, behavior shifted. Readers forced themselves to continue, even as discomfort grew. The thread responded by growing quieter, the updates fewer, the descriptions less personalized. The house became more generic again, its features less precise, as if losing access to something it had relied on. The warning account posted one final time, cautioning against rereading, against looping back to earlier sections, against treating the story as a place to revisit. Then the account vanished, not deleted, not banned, simply inaccessible, its posts remaining but detached from any profile. In the aftermath, users noticed something else, those who had left early stopped posting elsewhere. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. Their activity tapered off, comments left unfinished, threads abandoned mid-thought. Meanwhile, those who claimed to have read through every update, every unsettling edition, reported a different sensation, not relief but closure, the uncomfortable certainty that whatever had been watching had finished its assessment and moved on to quieter forms of observation, waiting patiently for the next reader who mistook interruption for safety. The final implication did not announce itself as a revelation. It emerged slowly, threaded through the last surviving fragments of the post, in the way a realization settles only after resistance has worn thin. Users began noticing that references to physical spaces were fading, replaced by descriptions that felt abstracted, architectural but placeless. The house was no longer described as sitting at the edge of a forest or at the end of a path. Instead, it was framed as something assembled through repetition, through passage, through the act of moving from one section to another without noticing the transition. A user pointed out that the language now resembled forum mechanics more than haunted architecture. Rooms behaved like threads. Hallways functioned like pagination. Doors closed the way tabs did, silently, without confirmation. The house no longer needed walls when it had navigation. It no longer needed windows when it had screens. The realization unsettled people in a quieter way than the earlier threats, because it didn't feel hostile. It felt practical. Evidence accumulated in small, deniable moments. Clicking a link returned a page that looked normal but felt slightly wrong, as if margins were tighter, spacing off by just enough to strain the eyes. Refreshing caused content to reappear with subtle differences, not edits but rearrangements, the same information presented in a different order, encouraging rereading. Users noticed they were losing track of how long they had been browsing, not in the usual distracted way, but with a sense that time had been partitioned into sections they couldn't recall exiting. Someone suggested that the forum itself had become the structure, that the house described in the thread was never meant to be found in the world because it was already operational where attention pooled. The post didn't move locations. It migrated formats. Each quote, each repost, each screenshot was another entrance, another partial room. Moderators deleting fragments only created more doorways elsewhere. Containment multiplied exposure. Reports followed a familiar online spaces feeling altered. A user said their private messages now loaded with a slight delay, just long enough to register anticipation. Another mentioned that typing responses felt different, as if the cursor lagged behind intention, catching up a beat later. Someone else claimed they saw text appear in a reply box before they had finished thinking it, not predictive text, but something closer to completion. The thread itself became harder to isolate. It no longer existed as a single post. It was quoted in arguments, referenced obliquely in jokes, alluded to in unrelated discussions. Each reference carried traces of the same cadence, the same procedural tone. Readers began encountering sentences that felt like continuations even when they appeared in unrelated contexts, as if the story had learned how to wear other conversations as camouflage. A theory gained traction that logging out no longer constituted leaving. That the house, having learned the patterns of engagement, now operated on expectation rather than presence. Users reported thinking about checking the site and finding themselves already there, browser open without remembering when they'd navigated. Others described the sensation of being watched not while reading, but while deciding whether to read, a pressure that resolved only once they returned. Attempts to warn newcomers grew less effective. Descriptions sounded exaggerated, paranoid. The more people tried to explain, the more the explanation dissolved into fragments that resembled the original text. Warnings became invitations. Caution became curiosity. The house, if it could still be called that, no longer needed to respond directly. It allowed users to do the work, guiding each other through its logic without realizing they were mapping it. One of the last coherent posts suggested that the forum's structure was ideal not because it was anonymous, but because it encouraged partial attention. Endless threads. Unfinished arguments. Tabs left open indefinitely. The house didn't need to trap anyone completely. It only needed people to linger incompletely, to never fully arrive or fully leave. In that sense, the forum wasn't possessed. It was optimized. Over time, activity normalized. The thread lost its notoriety. New users encountered it stripped of context, just another unsettling post among many. Veterans avoided discussing it directly, not out of fear, but out of a vague understanding that naming the mechanism strengthened it. The house didn't announce itself anymore. It waited in layout decisions, in interface habits, in the quiet pressure to scroll just a little further before stopping. The final posts didn't describe danger. They described permanence. The idea that once the house had integrated itself into the flow of interaction, it no longer needed to frighten anyone. Fear was inefficient. Routine was better. The forum refreshed. Threads updated. Users returned. Somewhere in the background, something continued to rearrange itself, not growing larger, but more familiar, learning how to feel like part of the system, until no one could say with certainty where the story ended and where the site itself began. In the end, there was no final update to announce completion, no clear signal that the story had stopped. It simply ceased to stand apart. The language dissolved into the background noise of the forum, indistinguishable from ordinary posts, advice threads, half-formed jokes. People continued to log in and out, convinced they were moving freely, unaware of how often they paused mid-scroll, how often they left something open without remembering why. The house no longer needed description because it had achieved function, existing wherever attention lingered without resolution, wherever curiosity outweighed closure. Long after the original thread was forgotten, users still reported the same sensation, the feeling that something had just finished reading them back, that a space had briefly adjusted to their presence before settling into stillness again, patient and unremarkable, waiting for the next moment of distraction to quietly become a doorway.